My name is Peter Meinecke. I work for the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. I've been here about 2 months now as the assistant to the president of the. So FLOC is a union for migrant and seasonal laborers. It's primarily based out of the Midwest and now parts of the South. Basically, we guarantee freedom of association to migrant workers. Most of them live in Texas and travel north throughout the season. Or there's also guest workers, H-2A workers, and so we also cover them. So we form a grievance mechanism, so if they're being cheated out of their wages or they're being mistreated or given, poor housing conditions, and we create a mechanism where they can stand up for themselves and demand their rights, and then we follow through with our legal team and make sure everything is resolved. So that's FLOC. FLOC was started in 1967, as you mentioned, by Valdemar Velasquez, who was a migrant laborer himself. And he started noticing instances where he and his family were being cheated out of wages. They would get paid per acre in which they harvested, and as soon as he started figuring out how many feet were in an acre, he would realize that they were actually harvesting more acres than they were getting credit for, and he calculated it out and figured it out, and he took it to his father and said, look, we harvested 15 acres today and we only got paid for 12. And his father said, well, who are you going to complain to? And so he formed a union, basically. So, much in a similar vein to what Cesar Chavez did out in California, they banded together for, collective bargaining purposes and started demanding that they be treated fairly. And so the first campaign was against Campbell's Soup, which was the tomato pickers in this area. And that campaign was successful. They got raised wages. They got health care provided by Campbell's. After that, they've had successful campaigns with Mount Olive pickles, Vlasic pickles, Heinz USA, and right now the big campaign is in support of tobacco workers. So against corporations like Reynolds America or Philip Morris. We provide, if they need to use like computers or the internet, if they need, if they have something happen to them and they need legal representation, we often refer them to our lawyers, or if they have any sort of other social service issue, we'll hook them up with the agencies here in Toledo. Right, so right now we are in probably our 6th or 7th year of a campaign in support of tobacco workers. So tobacco workers are just criminally underpaid. They work just in just really long hours, 12 hours a day often, in just backbreaking labor, and they're paid what's called a prevailing wage, which is generally above the minimum wage. In North Carolina, I think it's $9.85 an hour, and in Kentucky it's $10.10 an hour, which is still just not a livable wage. And so in many instances, younger members of the family, like kids ages 13, sometimes they'll start when they're 8 or 9 years old out in the fields cutting tobacco. So our campaign is to raise wages. And so when FLOC begins negotiations, they don't go to the growers, they don't go to the farmers, because in many instances the farmers don't have enough money to be paying their laborers more. So FLOC goes to the major corporations who can afford to, who can afford an increase in the price of their products. And so we are negotiating with Reynolds right now. We're at the table with Reynolds, and basically our demands are that tobacco workers be granted freedom of association so that they can, so that they are empowered and can stand up and demand their rights. They'll get a union contract, so they'll get paid more for their work, so that younger kids won't have to work in the fields. Like the adults will be making enough money to provide for their families.
So children are working in the fields to supplement their family income because with just the adults' income they couldn't.
They can't survive based on what the adult is. Very focused on empowering the workers themselves. So give them a voice and give them agency and the ability to stand up for themselves. So FLOC, what we do is create a union for them, and then build in that union there's grievance mechanisms where they can raise complaints and issues. So we'll get complaints on a lot of their issues if they have, oftentimes we'll see injuries that go untreated because, something happens in the field, the grower doesn't want them, out of fields for, a day or a couple days. And so they just have to work through, they'll be bleeding out in the field. So, but if they have a union, they have a collective voice, and they can stand up and against these injustices without fear of retaliation. The way we see it is like, these are some of the hardest working people in our labor force, migrant workers. And so for them not to be able to meet their basic needs like food and health care and shelter and all of that is just an enormous injustice. So the best way we can help them is to empower them themselves, give them a voice to demand higher wages and better working conditions. Our big thing is like, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and these people are working, so hard to not be paid fairly is criminal. It's a huge. My very first trip, we uncovered one grower who had 20 of the guest workers, H2A workers, and he was paying. So the prevailing wage in Kentucky is $10.10 an hour, and he would write them out a check for the amount he owed them based on that rate. And he would leave it blank. He would have them sign the check, then he would cash the check himself, write in the amount that was owed, and then pay them in cash. And so he was paying them effectively $6 an hour, which is not only below the prevailing wage but below the federal minimum wage.
Right.
And he was stealing their workers' comp claim or their settlement money. So there's just untold numbers of. I mean, this was just one camp on our very first trip. So as we delve more and more into Kentucky, I'm sure we'll uncover a ton of these. So it's really it's all just hidden. Like, I mean, I lived in Toledo my entire life, and right outside of Toledo there are dozens of migrant labor camps, and I just never knew anything about it. And I think people are very disconnected from where their food comes from, and also the labor force that goes into picking. The major issue is that they don't have time, or they don't they feel very uncomfortable going out into these places where they're not going to know anyone. They might not speak the language very well. So that's one thing FLOC has done. We've brought mobile clinics to the actual labor movement. Well, with tobacco workers, because it's such a chemical intensive crop, if they can't shower properly after leaving the fields, they can get nicotine poisoning. I think they call it green tobacco poisoning, and it's because they work out in the field all day with very little protection from the sun, and there's a number of times when they don't get access to adequate water because they're being mistreated by